So today's topic is about 3ds Max design, more specifically taking models from Civil 3D into 3ds Max design. It does assume some knowledge of Civil 3D, but it's going to be pretty introductory for 3ds Max design. So I figured I would just give a little bit of background about what 3ds Max is. It's a 3D design, modeling, animation, rendering tool. It's a full-blown photorealistic rendering or visualization tool. It's a whole separate tool. It's not a separate tool just for Civil 3D. It's used for many different disciplines within the AEC, E&I industry, as well as outside of it. What it does is it takes data and models from many different sources, and you piece this stuff together to make visualizations with a whole host of tools. And the purpose of it is to be selling designs, perhaps to win work, or to communicate designs to the public. And it's all before construction, where you might have some actual photos of the project being built. So 3ds Max design is included in the infrastructure design suite in the premium and the ultimate versions. If you're not aware, there's 3 versions there. Most people have the premium version. That's the one that you need to get to have Civil 3D. So this software is available in both of those suites. Specifically, what we're going to focus on today is the Civil View module. And you will want that as a Civil 3D user. You will want that Civil View module add-in. It used to be a separate subscription center download. Now it is just part of the suite install. And so you can see it in the image on the right there, the Civil View drop-down menu. It's really pretty nice because about 90% of what we would care about in 3ds Max is in that tab or in that drop-down. So it's very handy. It makes it easy for us to get around in an otherwise really robust program to be able to get around and do some pretty simple things quite quickly. So 3ds Max design, you might be wondering, what is it like compared to InfraWorks? Some of you may have used InfraWorks. That's a conceptual design tool, and there certainly is some overlap. They are both visualization tools. But one of the main differences, a few of the main differences, is that 3ds Max design is much more robust. You can create animations. That's one of the main distinctions between InfraWorks and 3ds Max design is animation. Now you can do flyovers and things like that, but you can't make objects move like cars or people or anything like that in InfraWorks. So 3ds Max does animation, and the quality of the visualizations are considerably better than what you would generate in InfraWorks. So where we're going to start today is by exporting from an existing Civil 3D model, and it's going to be a kind of a transportation-focused presentation today. And some of the couple things you need to know in Civil 3D is the export to Civil View for 3ds Max design. That's on the Output tab of Civil 3D. And what this does is it exports a file that can be imported into 3ds Max. The second image you see there is the export dialog box. And a lot of what happens during this export is there's a lot of mapping that goes on, and there's what's called a VSP CFG file. It's a configuration file, and there's one that comes with it that's out of the box that works quite well with the out-of-the-box render materials and such that are available in Civil 3D, and it's a great place to get started with it. That being said, you can open that using the Edit button, and you can configure that VSP CFG file to map things in any way you want. So what it actually creates is the VSP 3D file, and that's the model that gets exported. So this mapping file is required because it's not just one big static object that gets pushed out. one of the cool things it does is it will take a corridor surface, for example, and it will, in a way, divide that up based on the different link codes in the corridor. You know, in Civil 3D, a corridor surface, it's just one object, and you can only assign one render material to it. When you export that to Civil 3D, you will have multiple options, and we'll get into some of that. So let's go ahead and jump into Civil 3D. So I'm in Civil 3D 2014 here. I was going to do it in 2015, but my 2015 install got corrupted, and but for the purpose of this demonstration, it doesn't really matter. The Civil View add-on, the functionality is the same between 14 and 15. So what I have in front of me here is a existing ground surface with a fairly simple corridor created on top of it, and I have an image X-referenced in here as well. This corridor is fairly straightforward in that it's daylighting to existing ground. We're going to use this as our export option, or our model that we're going to export to 3ds Max. I want to point out just a couple things here. If I pick on the corridor and I go to my code set style, so our code set style is what represents all the different components of our corridor. If I expand link, for example, these codes play a big role in how things export to 3ds Max. Now there's quite a bit to it, and we could spend hours talking about it, but it's this detail in your corridor that plays a pretty big role in how things are mapped and then exported to 3ds Max design. So let's go ahead to the Output tab. And I'm going to run the export to Civil View for 3ds Max. And I get that dialog box that we saw in the PowerPoint. And what you see on the left here is my drawing name, and then the two categories of Civil 3D objects that I have available for export. We can export all sorts of things. We can export pipe networks, point groups, all sorts of things. What we have is a corridor and some surfaces. Right at the top here, I want to point out one thing, the link code filter. This is so that it will only export link codes that are at the top of the corridor. And so what that means is in 3ds Max, we're concerned with a visualization of the finished grade of the surface. We're not visualizing the subgrade. We certainly could do it, but in this case, we're visualizing a finished product, a finished design. And so what this will do is basically filter out all those base and sub-base layers and only give us the top. It makes for a lighter model export. So here's that configuration file I mentioned. I could hit load and browse out and pick another one that I've customized. Or right here I can also hit edit. And there's actually some nice instructions on here on how this thing is set up. But this is the mapping file that will dictate Civil 3D objects and how they get mapped to 3ds Max materials. So I'm going to take the default settings here and I'm going to hit export. I'm going to export this to a Civil View model. And the export for kind of a medium-sized drawing takes a few minutes, so we're not going to sit here and wait for it, but it should take just a couple minutes. I do have an export I had done just before the presentation here, so we're going to use one of those instead, but it's a couple of minutes to export something of this size. So if I jump over to 3ds Max, we'll start here. So this is an empty drawing, blank drawing. 3ds Max looks a little different. There's not a ribbon in it. There's drop-down menus, a number of other things. Here is the Civil View menu. This is the one I mentioned that we're mostly concerned with. This is where, like I said, 90% of our tools are in 3ds Max for civil infrastructure type visualizations. And the first time you run this, you'll have an option where you have to say initialize Civil View, but after that, the menus will be loaded here. So if I go to Geometry Import, I'll have a Civil 3D VSP 3D file that I can import. I get the import window. Right at the top left here, I have an open button. I'll go ahead and browse to that. While I'm browsing here, one question came in. Can you enter multiple link codes to the filter? Absolutely, you can. And you would separate it with commas in the same way you would put multiple link codes in a subassembly's properties. So let me go and browse to that export from Civil 3D. Grab this one here and open. And what I get in here is a number of different options here. On the left here, you see all the type of Civil 3D objects I could import into 3ds. And when I didn't have any of those, it says 0. And then the ones that I do have, it is calling those out. So we can bring in a ton of information here. What I'm mostly concerned with is the center line. That's my baseline. It's a corridor baseline. I want to be doing things like linking perhaps road striping to this center line. I'm also going to bring my edge of travel way. I'm going to use this as a reference line as well to create some road striping. I've got my existing ground surface. I can check that on. And then that corridor, I can check on region 1 and bring in the entire corridor region's surface. So the rest of these are all corridor feature lines, and those would come in as single lines. And so the reason you would bring those in is when you need to use those as some kind of reference line to insert objects. But we'll be fine with just the baseline itself and then the edge of travel line. So I'll hit OK. Gives me a couple prompts about coordinate system stuff. I'm not going to get into that. And then also some styling defaults. I'm going to hit yes on those. We're going to let this import. It takes not too long, a file of this size, maybe 5 seconds or so. We'll let it spool for a second there. And it brings it in. Okay. So a couple things about navigation in 3ds. It's pretty similar to AutoCAD products. I use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. I use it to pan. Now the panning I get is more of a perspective type view. Okay. Then the one distinction is I hold the Alt button with my mouse wheel to do orbiting. So in AutoCAD, not generally a good practice with 3D objects, but you would be holding Shift in your mouse wheel, and here it's Alt in your mouse wheel. So just a little something to keep you on your toes. All right, so what we have here, this is the default view of the surface as it comes in. And I can pick on that and actually see all the triangles show up there. What we want to do is we want to drape that aerial image on top of this. So this would be one of the first things we would do. And we do all of this through the Civil View Explorer. So I can turn this on. I get this small window right here. Similar to Civil 3D, I have a dock option. I'm going to dock it to the left. Now when I pick on an object, you get a properties, kind of set of properties in this Civil View Explorer. And so right over here, I've selected that existing surface. It shows up right over here, and I have a number of options. So it's just kind of like the properties window in AutoCAD. I can come here to draping, and I can choose an image to drape on top of this surface. That's what we're going to do first. Choose bitmap. And I'm going to browse out and go grab that same image that I had X-referenced into Civil 3D. And deselect that, and then that image comes in. So you can kind of see that that image is draped on existing ground. And then there's my corridor right next to it. So let's look a little more closely at our corridor. The materials that were assigned here, these were based on the link codes in that corridor. And they're pretty detailed. If I zoom in pretty close there, we see some pretty decent concrete patterns and so forth. You do have similar render materials in Civil 3D. It's just to be turning that stuff on and using it, the performance is nothing like what you can do in here. You can't take something like this in Civil 3D and just orbit like this. You'd have some real performance problems. Okay, another thing we're going to do is assign a daylight source. Okay, those of you who might have used InfraWorks, daylight is fairly straightforward. In there, you basically turn it on, or it comes on automatically. And it can do that because everything in InfraWorks is geo-referenced. In 3ds Max, we're not necessarily geo-referenced, so I have to just kind of put in a daylight source. So I can come up here to Environmental and Lighting, and I have Daylight, and I can say Create Daylight System. And if I go to a top view, I can make sure that this is kind of over my model. Go to a side view there, we'll also drag it up above my model. So just an arbitrary location. But we will need some kind of daylight source to be getting shadows on the objects that we put into our model. I can kind of establish a view like this, and then I can come up here and say set current view as home. I can get back to this view at any time. Now, a road project like this, a lot of the visualization we want to achieve is perhaps a video driving down the road. So we have to set up what's called a camera, and it'll generate a camera view. And we can attach this camera to objects in our model. So if I come up to Civil View here, I have Object Placement Style Editor. And what we see at the bottom here are 6 different tabs. These are kind of the major categories of objects that we can place into our model. Cameras is the one we're after right now. So the way this works is you hit the Add New Element button. I'll click on this. And then I'll come over here and set my object type to categories. And I can grab different cameras here. I'll grab this one. And then we have to basically attach or assign this camera to a location. So I need to pick the parent shape, it's called. And what this is going to be is the center line of the road. So I'm picking that right there. And the icon kind of changes when you're hovering over something you can select. And you'll know you got the right one because we can look at the shape name in here, and there's my centerline one. That's that baseline that I had decided to import into 3ds. Okay, and then I can pick a speed of my camera. Okay, we're actually in metric here, but I'm going to give it a speed of, say, 50. And right now, this camera is sitting right at the baseline of the road. So we want to give it some kind of an offset. So where would a road be driving? A couple in the right lane, a couple meters to the right, and then we can put it up in the air a little bit, like that. If I hit Apply, it's then going to create that camera. And what it does is it puts a camera view right in my camera options. And now I can jump to that camera view, and now I can drive along the road with that camera. Okay, I can just hit play like this. It's driving along the speed I gave it. I can hit pause, and I can grab this slider and just bring myself up and down that road very easily. Okay. So that camera's in place. It's kind of one of the first steps. Now we can start dropping objects into our model. So I'm going to hit OK. And we're going to put in some striping. So again, under the Civil View tab, there's some Road Markings Style Editor. We can go to there and start adding some striping. And everything that we add in here in terms of objects, road markings, whatever it is, it's always referencing objects in our model. And in the case of when we have a big corridor model, most everything is going to be referencing baselines or feature lines or something like that to attach to our model. So I can hit the Add New Element button up here, and we're going to put a stripe down the center line here. So if I hit Apply right away, not quite yet. I have to pick again. I have to attach it to something. So here's the pick Shape button. And I can come out here, and similar to the camera, I can pick that baseline. Now if I hit Apply, we'll see the default road marking show up. And now I can start to customize this. I can give it a different color, for example. That's a yellow color. Hit Apply, now it's yellow. I can put in a marking length and a gap length. When I do that, I get yellow stripes down the middle of the road. It could be a double stripe. It could, whatever you're after there. Okay. What about striping on the side of the road? I can add a new element here. In this one, what we want to attach to, remember those edge of travelway features? We brought one in right here, and we brought one in right here. If I pick either one of them, it's going to find those, Civil 3D feature line, ETW, and it's going to find those, and it's going to assign a stripe to each one of those. So tons of options here, how we add markings in there, and they're actually pretty straightforward. You're just referencing baselines, feature lines, and it attaches to it. And drag my camera slider back and forth. See those markings in there. So markings, pretty straightforward. Let's look at putting some cars in there. Let's go back to my Civil View, my Object Placement Style Editor. So road markings don't count as objects. Objects are things like cars, cameras, light posts, signs, that sort of thing. So Object Placement Editor. And this time I'm going to add a new component, so same as last time, add new, or element rather. And instead we're going to put in cars. So I select what I want down here, cars. And the setup is kind of the same again. I have to attach it to something in my model. We're going to attach it to the center line, baseline again. Again, that shows up here, center line 1. Another question came in, how does the road marking style handle multiple regions where feature lines might be discontinuous? When I'm selecting the edge of travelway feature line, I'm not picking a single object, and it's more like I'm referencing the point code of that feature line. That's why I put stripes on both of those feature lines. So I actually had 2 ETW feature lines in there, and it assigned it to both of them. So it's kind of like a Civil 3D corridor code set style in that you assign styles to certain codes, and it applies to all of those codes wherever they're found. All right, let's continue with the cars here. I assigned it to the center line of the road. The longitudinal placement, I can place a single object, or I can also go multiple objects at a regular interval. We can put whatever kind of interval we want, let's say perhaps 45. Start and end station, I'm going to do the full range of my model. And then a speed, let's do something faster than our camera view. So I'm going to go up to 80 there. My horizontal offset, again, I'm going to do the same, 2 feet. That'll bring me to the right. And we don't want any vertical offset. We want that placed right on there. Okay. And then there's another little checkbox here called Use Random Objects from the Selected Category. So my category is cars, and I have a whole set of cars in here. It's going to randomly place those into my model. So if I hit Apply, these are fairly detailed cars it has to create, so it takes just a few seconds to process it. You can see that progress bar down there. And it's going to place these cars in based on what I set up, referencing the center line, offset in a certain way. Okay. And if you dropped it in and your car showed up on your sidewalk, not a big deal. You would just come up here, adjust your horizontal offset, and away you would go. So now I can, in the middle of this, grab my camera slider. Remember how we set our camera to a speed of 50 kilometers per hour, and then we set our cars to 80. So this is what our video will look like. We'll have cars coming underneath us, and it's like we're hovering above the road. So kind of a nice view. So what about cars coming on the opposite side of the road? We have to set up basically the same thing, but we have to basically reverse the parameters. So I have to add a new element again, right up at the top here. This one we can do cars again. Well, let's do SUVs. Make it interesting. The parent shape, we need to pick that again. Make sure that that's set to center line. We're again going to do multiple placement. The interval, we can make this different than the other side. Do 75 on there. And then here's kind of a trick to this. Everything is based on a baseline that has a 0 station and then an ending station. So the direction is the direction of that baseline or of that alignment. So if we want the car to be going down the alignment, we have to put in a negative speed. So the same speed, 80 kilometers per hour, but it's going to be negative, so they're coming back at us. And now the offset from center line needs to be a -2, and then we'll put it to the left side of the road. And then what about the rotation? We didn't do anything there because we wanted them facing forward, but now we actually need to rotate these backwards so that they come at us and they're facing us. And again, I'll say use random objects from the selected category. I'll hit apply, we'll let that process, and then we'll be able to see cars in the opposite lane as well. We won't have time to put a ton of objects in here, but in the same way that I'm putting these cars in, the furniture there, trees and plants, signs, it's all kind of set up the same way. In fact, some of them are simpler because, if they're just light posts, for example, they're not really moving, so we don't have any animation options or anything like that. Okay. Now I can hit play, so this is just a free-flowing play. We can go right down the road in this way. So many different ways to kind of visualize what you've created here. We just use the center line of the road for our camera. But there's nothing saying you couldn't define any other path. And in fact, there's a number of tools to define that in here. Any other path to be kind of presenting your road here. We could have put this up at 50 meters above the road, and we get much more of a helicopter view. There's a lot of options there. Well, one thing you might have noticed in here, when I got around some of those turns, was real evident at the right back here. What does that look like? That curve there. Does that remind you of corridor modeling in Civil 3D? Frequency, corridor frequency? Yeah, so if we jump back into Civil 3D here, that curve is right here. And what does the frequency look like? Frequency is not very high. So the frequency in your corridor in Civil 3D will dictate how detailed your model looks in 3ds Max. Because all it's doing is taking that same geometry and just applying more complex rendering patterns to give you a better visualization. So you'd have to do something a little more detailed like this. If I'm back in Civil 3D like this, I go to edit frequency, and we edit the frequency of this region. and I set this to 5 on curves, that's going to give us curves that are a lot more detailed. I'd then be able to come back into 3ds Max, and I'm not going to do it live here because it takes a little bit of time, but you have Import Object Manager, and you can come in here and you can refresh the export. So what that would mean is back in here I would say Export Civil View for 3ds Max, and then in 3ds Max I would come here, Import Object Manager, when I would grab this stuff and I would say Update Selected Objects. So that export from Civil 3D would overwrite the old one and update that frequency there. We'd be sitting here watching it spool for 5 minutes or so. So I'm not going to do that live, but it's fairly straightforward. So visualizations, I mean, right here, this is pretty nice looking picture. But how do you get some of this information out of here? Some of the most simplest stuff is just creating renderings, right? So videos or images. A little teapot button here, rendered frame window. This is pretty straightforward. You put yourself in a view that you want. You click the rendered frame window button, and the render window opens up. I can make this a little bit bigger. And I simply hit the render button, and we'll let it spool for a second here, and it's going to take the picture we have set up here, and it's going to render it in a lot more detail than we actually have. And now we actually see a sky there. We see a lot more detailed looking shadows. Okay. So when I'm working live in the 3ds model, the quality of the visualization is turned down a little bit, but I can push out renderings and I can get something that's pretty photorealistic. And I have some of these settings like image precision and things like this. I've set it pretty low, and what I get here right out of the box with just what I've created in 15-20 minutes is really a pretty nice rendering. So some of the main takeaways from this is 3ds. It's a very robust tool, but all you kind of are really concerned with is this Civil View Explorer here. It opens this window here, okay, and that's almost all the work you want to do right there. Most of the object placement you're going to use the Object Placement Style Editor. You see some other ones there, rail objects, building objects, okay, so they all work pretty straightforward, like this, where we just grab objects and we attach them to different objects or entities in our corridor. Now, this certainly doesn't have to be a corridor-based visualization. We can bring in feature lines from some kind of site grading, but the nature of corridors in Civil 3D are that they're kind of the most complex, data-rich objects in there, and as such, they'll give us much more quickly that information to work with in 3ds Max.